The Mapmaker's Impossible Atlas. The package arrived on a Thursday with no return address. Mira found it on her doorstep when she came home from another long shift at the mapping company where she'd worked for 12 years. The box was old leather, worn smooth by time and handling, secured with brass clasps that had oxidized to deep green. Her name was written across the top in handwriting she didn't recognize. Mira Chen, cartographer. Not Ms. Chen. Not her address. Just her name and title, as if whoever sent it knew exactly who she was and what she did. Mira brought the box inside, set it on her kitchen table, and stared at it for a long time. She should have been wary. Packages didn't just appear without postage or sender information. But curiosity won out over caution, and she opened the brass clasps with a satisfying click. Inside was an atlas, not a modern atlas, with satellite imagery and precise coordinates. This was old, the kind of atlas explorers might have carried centuries ago, with hand-drawn maps and elaborate illustrations in the margins. The leather cover was embossed with a title in fading gold letters, Atlas of the Unmapped Heart. Mira opened it carefully, and her breath caught. The first page showed a map, but not of any place she recognized. The coastlines were irregular, the terrain marked with symbols she'd never seen in cartographic notation. Mountains labeled regret, rivers called tears not cried, a forest named words left unspoken, and at the center, a city, the place you stopped dreaming. She turned the page. Another map, this one showing an island chain. The Archipelago of Broken Promises, the title read. Each island was named. I'll write tomorrow. I'll visit next year. I'll tell them I love them soon. Page after page revealed maps of impossible places. The desert of abandoned hobbies, the valley of relationships you let die, the mountain range of fears that held you back. And then Mira reached a map that made her hands tremble. It was labeled, The Route Mira Chen Never Took. It showed a path starting from a city marked Portland, age 22, branching into multiple possible directions. One branch led to the art school in Paris you were accepted to. Another wound through the startup you were invited to join. A third pointed toward the man you said no to because the timing wasn't right. Each branch dead-ended at some point along the path, marked with dates and brief notes in that same unknown handwriting. Chose safety over passion, 2012. Chose practicality over happiness, 2015. Chose fear over love, 2018. Mira closed the atlas with shaking hands. This was impossible. No one knew these things about her. These were private moments, private choices, private regrets she'd never shared with anyone. She opened the atlas again, this time to the very first page. There was an inscription she'd missed before. Dear cartographer, you have spent 12 years mapping the world, for others, while leaving your own heart unmapped. This atlas is your inheritance from Aunt Margaret, who spent 60 years making the same mistake. She sends it now, too late for her, but perhaps not too late for you, with this instruction: map your own terrain, chart your own course, before you run out of territory to explore. The atlas will show you where you've been and where you chose not to go. What you do with that knowledge is yours alone to decide. May you be braver than she was. The Keeper of Unmapped Places. Aunt Margaret, Mira's only living relative, who she'd visited perhaps twice a year, out of obligation rather than affection. A woman who'd lived alone in a small house, filled with maps and globes, who'd talked obsessively about places she'd never visited and adventures she'd never had. Mira pulled out her phone and called her aunt's number. It rang 4 times before a stranger answered. Hello? Is Margaret there? Margaret Chen? A pause. I'm sorry, who is? This? Her niece, Mira. I need to speak with her. I'm so sorry to have to tell you this. Margaret passed away 3 days ago. Heart failure. It was very sudden. The phone nearly slipped from Mira's hand. 3 days ago? Yes. Are you family? We've been trying to reach her relatives about the estate. Mira ended the call in a daze. 3 days ago, and the package had arrived today with an atlas supposedly from her aunt. An atlas that showed maps of emotion and choice and all the paths Mira hadn't taken. She opened the atlas again, this time to a map she hadn't seen before. It had appeared, she was certain it hadn't been there moments ago, showing a location labeled Margaret's Last Message. The map depicted a house, her aunt's house, and in the study, marked with an X, was a note, "Look in the globe." Mira grabbed her keys and drove across the city to her aunt's small craftsman bungalow. The spare key was still under the flower pot. Inside, the house smelled of dust and lavender, and the particular loneliness of someone who'd lived too long alone. The study was exactly as Mira remembered. Walls covered with maps, a large mahogany desk, and in the corner, a globe nearly 4 feet in diameter. Mira approached it, running her hands over its surface, looking for an opening. There, a seam along the equator. The globe opened like a locket, and inside was a letter. Mira's hands shook as she unfolded the yellowed paper. "My dear Mira, if you're reading this, then you've received the atlas, and you've come looking for answers. Good. That means there's still hope for you. I'm writing this on my 70th birthday, knowing I don't have much time left, knowing I've wasted most of the time I had. I want to tell you a story, so you don't make the same mistakes I did. When I was 22, I was accepted to study cartography in London. The love of my life asked me to go with him. But I was afraid of leaving home, of following a man, of not being practical. So I said no, stayed here, took a safe job, mapped other people's adventures while having none of my own. Every year, I told myself I'd visit next year. I'd take that trip. I'd reach out to him. I'd live the life I'd planned. But next year never came. Fear has a way of making tomorrow never arrive. I made that atlas when I was 40, thinking I'd use it as motivation to finally change. I mapped out all the emotions I'd never felt, all the places I'd never been, all the choices I'd let fear make for me. I thought seeing it all laid out would push me to act. It didn't. I just added more maps, more regrets, more paths I didn't take. Don't do what I did, Mira. Don't spend your life mapping what could have been. Don't let fear of the unknown keep you in the familiar. Don't wait until you're 70 to realize you've been living in the wrong territory all along. The atlas is magic, or as close to it as makes no difference. It will show you where you are, emotionally and spiritually. It will show you the terrain of your heart. And if you're brave enough to really look at those maps, to really see what you've been avoiding, it will show you the way forward. But you have to be brave enough to take it. I wasn't. I hope you are. With all my love and all my regrets, Aunt Margaret. Mira sat on the floor of her aunt's study, the letter clutched in her hands, and cried. For her aunt, who'd spent 70 years mapping regret. For herself, who'd spent 12 years following exactly the same pattern. For all the people who died having never explored the territories of their own hearts. When she finally stopped crying, she picked up the atlas again. This time, she turned to the end, to the blank pages that every atlas has for notes or additions. Except these pages weren't blank. They were becoming maps as she watched. Maps of territories yet unexplored, paths she could still choose to take. The journey to the art school Mira could still attend at 34. The route to reconnecting with the man named David who still thinks about her. The path to starting the freelance cartography business she's always dreamed of. Each map showed not just the destination, but the terrain along the way, the obstacles she'd face, the fears she'd have to cross, the comfort zones she'd need to leave behind, but also the wonders she'd discover, the joy waiting on the other side, the version of herself she'd become if she dared to take the journey. Mira spent hours in her aunt's study, reading these maps of possible futures. Some paths scared her, some seemed impossible, some required giving up the security and stability she'd spent 12 years building. But all of them led to a place called the Land of No Regrets, and none of them were routes her current life was taking her. As dawn broke, Mira made a decision. She took the atlas home and spent the weekend studying it. Really studying it, the way she studied maps at work, looking for routes, planning a journey, charting a course. On Monday, she didn't go to work. Instead, she went to the library and researched art schools. Found one offering a master's program in illustration and cartography, combining her two passions. The deadline for applications was in 2 weeks. She spent those 2 weeks creating a portfolio, drew maps unlike any she'd made for work, emotional maps, fantasy maps, maps that told stories instead of just showing locations. She poured her heart into them, drew them the way she used to draw before practical became her guiding principle. She submitted her application on the last possible day. Then she called David, the man she'd dated briefly 7 years ago, before she'd broken it off because she'd been too scared to let anyone get that close. She'd thought about him often over the years, wondered where he was, what he was doing, if he ever thought about her. He answered on the 3rd ring. "Mira?" His voice was surprised but warm. Wow. How are you?" "Scared," she said honestly. "I'm calling because I'm trying to be braver than I've been. And 7 years ago, I made a mistake. I let fear make a decision for me, and I've regretted it ever since." There was a long pause. Then David said, "I'm glad you called. I've thought about you too." They talked for 2 hours, made plans to meet for coffee. Didn't make any promises beyond that, but it was a start. A path she'd thought was closed, turning out to be still navigable, just overgrown from disuse. Over the following months, Mira's life began to change. She was accepted to the art program, gave notice at her job, moved to a smaller, cheaper apartment to afford tuition, started dating David again, slowly, carefully, both of them older and warier, but also braver. And every week she consulted the atlas. New maps appeared regularly, showing her current emotional terrain. The forest of anxiety about money, the mountain of imposter syndrome, the river of joy you're finally allowing yourself to feel. The atlas never lied. It showed her exactly where she was, and exactly what she was avoiding. But it also showed her the routes through difficult terrain, the paths that led to better territory. A year after receiving the atlas, Mira opened it to find a new map. This one was labeled, "The Territory You've Claimed." It showed a landscape transformed. The desert of abandoned hobbies was blooming. The valley of relationships you let die had become a thriving ecosystem. The place you stopped dreaming had been renamed the City of New Beginnings. And at the center of the map, where her own heart should be, was a label, "Home, at last." Mira understood then. The atlas wasn't just showing her maps, it was showing her progress, proving that internal geography could change, that emotional terrain could be reclaimed, that it was never too late to become an explorer of your own heart. She thought about Aunt Margaret, about the letter, about a woman who'd spent 70 years wishing she'd been braver. Mira wouldn't make that same mistake. She was mapping her own course now, charting her own territory, exploring landscapes she'd been too afraid to visit before. The atlas remained her companion through all of it, through the struggles of art school, through the nervous joy of falling in love again, through the terror of quitting her stable job and the triumph of landing her first freelance clients, through all the fears and doubts and moments of wanting to turn back to the safety of the known. Every time she faltered, she consulted the atlas, and every time it showed her the same truth. The routes through fear led to better destinations than staying in the familiar. 5 years after receiving the package, Mira published her own atlas, Maps of the Heart, a cartographer's journey through emotional terrain. It combined her artistic skills with her mapping knowledge, creating something entirely new, maps that showed internal geography, illustrated journeys of growth and change. The book was dedicated to Aunt Margaret, who taught me, through her regrets, to chart my own course. It was a success, not a bestseller, but successful enough. More importantly, it was authentic. It was hers. It was the work she was meant to do, combining art and science and storytelling in ways her old job never had. David proposed on a Thursday, 5 years to the day after the mysterious atlas had arrived. They got married in Aunt Margaret's old garden, which Mira had inherited and restored. The wedding was small, intimate, filled with people who mattered rather than people who were obligated to attend. And that night, Mira opened the atlas one last time. Most of the pages were gone now, not destroyed but transformed. The maps of regret had faded away, replaced by maps of territory claimed. The desert of abandoned hobbies had become the garden of creative fulfillment. The valley of relationships you let die had become the thriving ecosystem of love and connection. Only one map remained from the original atlas. It showed the path Aunt Margaret had never taken, the life she'd never lived. But now, in the margins, new notes had appeared in that same mysterious handwriting. Your aunt sends her love from wherever cartographers go when their mapping is done. She is proud of you. She is glad one of you found the courage she lacked. She says to tell you, some people are meant to be warnings, and some are meant to be examples. She's glad she could be the warning that led you to become the example. Mira closed the atlas with tears in her eyes. Happy tears this time. Grateful tears. She'd been given a gift. Not just the atlas itself, but the lesson it taught. That life wasn't about following predetermined routes or staying in safe, mapped territory. It was about being brave enough to explore, to claim new ground, to chart your own course even when the terrain looked scary. She'd learned to read the maps of her own heart, and more importantly, she'd learned to act on what those maps showed her, to journey through difficult terrain rather than avoiding it, to explore the landscapes of emotion and choice that most people were too afraid to navigate. The atlas sat on a shelf in her studio now, a reminder and a guide. Sometimes she opened it, checking the maps of her current emotional state, seeing what territories needed attention. Sometimes she just touched its cover, grateful for the inheritance Aunt Margaret had left her. Not money, not property, but wisdom bought through regret. Maps drawn from painful experience. The gift of seeing clearly what fear and inaction had cost, and the courage to choose differently. Years passed. Mira and David had 2 children and raised them with atlases, both traditional and emotional, taught them to navigate not just physical geography, but the landscapes of their own hearts, taught them to be brave, to explore, to not let fear of unknown terrain keep them living in comfortable but confining territory. And when Mira was 70, the age Aunt Margaret had been when she'd written that letter, she opened the atlas one last time. A new map had appeared, the final map. It showed a life well lived, territories explored, fears conquered, joys discovered. It showed a woman who'd been brave enough to leave safe harbors and explore unknown waters, who'd charted her own course instead of following someone else's map. The title read simply, The Complete Atlas of Mira Chen, Cartographer, Artist, Wife, Mother, Explorer of Hearts. And in the margin, one final note in that mysterious handwriting, Well done, traveller. Your aunt is proud. Your children will inherit this atlas when you're gone, as you inherited it. The tradition continues. The maps endure. The exploration never ends. May all cartographers be so brave. May all hearts be so thoroughly mapped. May all journeys lead to territories worth claiming. The keeper of unmapped places. Mira smiled and closed the atlas for the last time. Her own maps were complete now, her territories claimed, her course charted and followed. She'd lived the life Aunt Margaret had been too afraid to live, and in doing so, she'd made sure the next generation would have both examples and warnings to guide them. That was the true gift of the atlas. Not the magic, though that was real enough, but the lesson that the most important terrain we'll ever explore is internal. The most crucial maps are emotional, and the bravest journey is always the one toward understanding our own hearts. Mira had taken that journey, had crossed the deserts and mountains and rivers of her own emotional landscape, had claimed territory she'd once been too afraid to visit, and now, at 70, she could look back at her maps and see a life fully lived, fully explored, fully present, no regrets, just gratitude for an impossible atlas and an aunt brave enough to admit her mistakes so her niece could avoid them. The package had arrived on a Thursday with no return address, but the gift it contained, the courage to map and claim your own heart, that was addressed to everyone brave enough to open it. Mira had opened it, had studied its maps, had followed its guidance, and in doing so had discovered the most beautiful territory of all, a life lived according to her own compass, guided by her own maps, charted by her own brave, careful, loving hands. The atlas endured, the lesson remained. And somewhere, in whatever realm cartographers go when their work is done, Aunt Margaret smiled. One traveler had made it through, one explorer had claimed her territory. One heart had been thoroughly, beautifully, courageously mapped. And the atlas waited on the shelf, ready for the next generation to inherit its wisdom, its warnings, and its promise. That the greatest adventure is always internal. That the most important maps are emotional. And that it's never too late to become an explorer of your own magnificent, terrifying, beautiful heart.